The origins of the Tutsi and Hutu peoples is a major issue in the histories of Rwanda and Burundi, as well as the Great Lakes region of Africa. While the Hutu are generally recognized as the ethnic majority of Rwanda, in racialist ideology the Tutsi were often identified as originally a foreign race that settled amongst and intermarried with the Hutu, a Bantu group that had arrived in the region earlier, during the Bantu expansion. The relationship between the two modern populations is thus, in many ways, derived from the perceived origins and claim to Rwandan-ness. The largest conflicts related to this question were the Rwandan Genocide, the Burundian Genocide, and the First and Second Congo Wars. Ugandan scholar Mahmoud Mamdani identifies at least 4 distinct foundations for studies that support the distinct difference between Hutu and Tutsi: school of thought, phenotype, genotype, cultural memory of inhabitants of Rwanda, and archaeology, linguistics. In comparison to the Hutu, the Tutsi have 3 times as much genetic influence from Nilo-Saharan populations as the Hutu, perhaps demonstrating a Nilo-Saharan origin that supports the pastoralist historical affiliations, as opposed to the Hutu who were primarily Bantu agriculturalists. However, a more recent study found 22.2% E1b1b in a Tutsi sample from Burundi, but 0% in the Hutu and Twa of Burundi, particularly of the M293 variety associated with southern Cushitic people and East African pastoralists. Genetic studies. More recent studies have emphasized physical appearance, such as height and nose width, in favor of examining blood factors, the presence of the sickle cell trait, lactose intolerance in adults, and other genotype expressions. Ex-Kofia et al. Found that the Tutsi and Hema, despite being surrounded by Bantu populations, are closer genetically to Cushites and Ethio-Semites. Another study concluded that, while the sickle cell trait among the Rwandan Hutu was comparable to that of neighboring people, it was almost non-existent among Rwandan Tutsi. Presence of the sickle cell trait is evidence of survival in the presence of malaria over many centuries, suggesting differing origins. Regional studies of the ability to digest lactose are also supported. The ability to digest lactose among adults is widespread only among desert-dwelling nomadic groups that have depended upon milk for millennia. 3/4 of the adult Tutsi of Rwanda and Burundi have a high ability to digest lactose, while only 5% of the adults of the neighboring Shi people of eastern Congo can. Among Hutu, 1 in 3 adults has a high capacity for lactose digestion, a surprisingly high number for an agrarian people, which Mamdani suggests may be the result of centuries of intermarriage with Tutsi. Bethwell-Oggett in the 1988 UNESCO General History further notes that the number of pastoralists in Rwanda increased sharply around the 15th century. Although Louis et al., in a more general study on biallelic markers in many African countries, found a statistically significant genetic difference between Tutsi and Hutu, the overall difference were not large. Y-DNA. Modern-day genetic studies of the Y chromosome suggest that the Tutsi, like the Hutu, are largely of Bantu extraction. Paternal genetic influences associated with the Horn of Africa and North Africa are few, and are ascribed to much earlier inhabitants who were assimilated. In comparison to the Hutu, the Tutsi have 3 times as much genetic influence from Nilo-Saharan populations as the Hutu. Trombetta et al. Found 22.2% E1b1b in a Tutsi sample from Burundi, but 0% in the Hutu and Twa of Burundi. Autosomal DNA. In general, the Tutsi appear to share a close genetic kinship with neighboring Bantu populations, particularly the Hutu. However, it is unclear whether this similarity is primarily due to extensive genetic exchanges between these communities through intermarriage or whether it ultimately stems from common origins. Generations of gene flow obliterated whatever clear-cut physical distinctions may have once existed between these two Bantu peoples, renowned to be height, body build, and facial features. With a spectrum of physical variation in the peoples, Belgian authorities legally mandated ethnic affiliation in the 1920s, based on economic criteria. Formal and discrete social divisions were consequently imposed upon ambiguous biological distinctions. To some extent, the permeability of these categories in the intervening decades helped to reify the biological distinctions, generating a taller elite and a shorter underclass, but with little relation to the gene pools that had existed a few centuries ago. The social categories are thus real, but there is little if any detectable genetic differentiation between Hutu and Tutsi. Tishkoff et al. Found the mixed Hutu and Tutsi samples from Rwanda to be predominantly of Bantu origin, with minor gene flow from Afro-Asiatic communities. Razib Khan, based on a non-peer-reviewed analysis of the autosomal genetics of a single individual who was three-quarters Tutsi, suggests that the Tutsi were in all likelihood once a Nilotic-speaking population, who switched to the language of the Bantus amongst whom they settled. Anthropological argument. While most supporters of the migration theory are also supporters of the Hamitic theory, namely that the Tutsi came from the Horn of Africa, a later theory proposed that the Tutsi had instead migrated from nearby interior East Africa, and that the physical differences were the result of natural selection in a dry arid climate over millennia. Among the most detailed theories was one put forward by Jean Hino, based on studies of blood factors and archaeology, noting the fossil record of a tall people with narrow facial features several thousand years ago in East Africa, including locations such as Gambel's Cave in the Kenya Rift Valley and Old Uva Gorge in northern Tanzania. Hino argues that while there was a migration, it was not as dramatic as some sources have proposed. He explicitly attacks the Hamitic theory that migrants from Ethiopia brought civilization to other Africans. However, in light of recent genetic studies, Hinox's theory on the origin of Tutsis in East Africa appears doubtful. It has also been demonstrated that the Tutsis harbor little to no northeastern African genetic influence on the paternal line. On the other hand, there is currently no mtDNA data available for the Tutsi, which might have helped shed light on the background. Migration hypothesis versus Hamitic hypothesis. The colonial scholars who found complex societies in sub-Saharan Africa developed the Hamitic hypothesis, namely that black Europeans had migrated into the African interior, conquering the primitive peoples they found there and introducing civilization. The Hamitic hypothesis continues to echo into the current day, both inside and outside of academic circles, as scholars developed a migration hypothesis for the origin of the Tutsi that rejected the Hamitic thesis. The notion that the Tutsi were civilizing alien conquerors was also put in question. One school of thought noted that the influx of pastoralists around the 15th century may have taken place over an extended period of time and been peaceful, rather than sudden and violent. The key distinction made was that migration was not the same as conquest. Other scholars de-linked the arrival of Tutsi from the development of pastoralism and the beginning of the period of state-building. It appears clear that pastoralism was practiced in Rwanda prior to the 15th century immigration, while the dates of state formation and pastoralist influx do not entirely match. This argument thus attempts to play down the importance importance of the pastoralist migrations. Still, other studies point out that cultural transmission can occur without actual human migration. This raises the question of how much of the changes around the 15th and 16th centuries was the result of an influx of people as opposed to the existing population being exposed to new ideas. Studies that approach the subject of racial purity are among the most controversial. These studies point out that the pastoralist migrants and pre-migration Rwandans lived side by side for centuries and practiced extensive intermarriage. The notion that current Rwandans can claim exclusively Tutsi or Hutu bloodlines is thus questioned.